Now we're finally getting to the last type of study. So we're going to talk a little bit in a bit more details about controlled experiments. This is the most complex in our linearly increasing complexity scale. And the reason why this is more complex is because the name says it already, right? It's a controlled experiment. So you have to be in control of everything all the way from the beginning before everything starts. Because in a control experiment, you actually interfere with the results, as opposed to observational study when you're just gathering data from things that are all there. And as if you noticed, I'm back from the dark because I actually got the light to work. So a control experiment is a little, for you specifically in this specific course, a control experiment is a little bit less applied, so to speak, because you're not going to do controlled experiments in this course. You're only going to do observational studies, either with one or two samples, which is part of the actual data gathering that you're doing. So you're not doing any kind of controlled experiment. But it's important to know because probably some of you, or even many of you, will actually do controlled experiments when it comes to your actual thesis, because that's the best way to determine any kind of answer to a research question that you may have in your thesis. So it's important to know more or less roughly how it works. And again, we've already been through this, but let's go quickly over the steps. You come up with an idea, again, about a population of interest. And in this case, the idea is related to a possible causal relationship between two factors. So it's not anymore about just any relationship between two factors. It's a causality relationship. So you assume, you have a hypothesis that a certain thing is causing something else to happen. The most easiest example here is when you have, for example, developed some kind of a new software, or you have improved a certain system or a certain application, an app. You either build it or you improve it. And the hypothesis in your case is that the new one is better than the previous one. Whether there was a previous one or there was a competition, for example, and then you build a new one to actually be better than the competition. And by better here, we mean that there is a way to measure this better. There is some kind of a measurable task that a person does in your app that is done better than in the other app or in the previous version. For example, let's say you have an app for searching for some place to fix your car because your car is broken, something like that. Then you have there is an app for that, and then you build a new one because you think the previous one is not good, so you want to build a better one. How would you establish the causal relationship between your app causing users to have a better search for let's say the mechanic to fix your car? Well, let's say you would take a few people and give them the old app or the competition, and you would give the new one, and then you would measure them and establish that your new app caused users to search for mechanics in a better way. So that was just like a rough overview, but basically after you come up with this idea, you sample your population of interest again, right? So you must always try to have representative samples. Always, this is the same for everyone, for every kind of study. But in this case, you actually split your sample into two groups. So see how this is different than the observational study, because in this case, you need to do one sample and then split it into two. And why is that? Because these two samples that you have split, they must be coming from the same distribution. They must be like as close to each other as possible, these two samples that you split. You cannot just take two samples that are completely different from each other, because if you do that, then it becomes very hard to determine exactly why these measurements were different between the groups. So if the groups are very homogeneous, if the groups come from the same sample, so you took a sample and then you split it, then the groups are very homogeneous. They're very much like each other. So if something happens to one of them that is different than the other, then you can with a lot of confidence, you can say, well, my treatment, my interference was the cause that made this group behave different than this other group. So they have to be homogeneous. That's the only way that you can establish this causality relationship between them. If they're not homogeneous, then how do you know? Like let's say I go to a certain city, like I go to Växjö and I take 30 people. Then I go to Malmö and I take 30 people. And then I measure something. And then I say, you know, that, well, that mechanics app thing. And the people from Växjö are using the old app. The people from Malmö are using the new app. And then the new app is better. And I say, yeah, my new app is better than the other one. But how do I know it? How do I know that the fact that the new app is really better, or if it's just because the people from Malmö, for some reason, they have more mechanics, so they found mechanics in an easier way than in Växjö for some reason. Because the two groups were so different from each other, so heterogeneous, that you don't know if the results you got are actually coming from some other factor from the outside. So it's very important that the groups are homogeneous. These two groups are called control and treatment. The control group is the baseline, which is like the old app in our case. And the treatment will test your new idea. So it's your new app or whatever it is that you want to interfere with. It's the treatment group. So you're like applying a treatment in a way. Then after you do this, you measure the difference between these two groups. If you find that there is a difference, then you can establish a causality for that difference as being that it comes, you're very confident that that difference comes from the actual treatment that you have applied to the treatment group and not to the control group. So you infer this possible causal relationship. In terms of terminology, when you have a controlled experiment, basically you have the explanatory variable or the independent variable. It's usually, I think independent variable is usually more common. This is the factor that you believe that will cause a difference. So in our example is whether they are using the old app or the new app. That is the independent variable. Why is it independent? It's because it doesn't depend on anything. Like the results, the value does not depend on some other variable. It depends only on me and actually like the way that I apply this into the groups, but that's not how it works. When you call it independent, it's because it doesn't depend on other factors. While the dependent variable, also called the response variable, is the one that will supposedly change. So the values will change depending on the explanatory variable. Depending on whether the explanatory variable is the old app or the new app, the response, which is the performance of the users, let's say, while using the app, that is dependent on the application of the treatment. So that's why it's called dependent, because it will change depending on which values of the explanatory variable are being applied. And then there are two groups here, treatment and control, but actually I've already talked about it, right? So control is the baseline, and treatment is the one who will be exposed to the infection. Now, there are some things here that is very important when you guys are going to do your own experiments. You have to keep this in mind because this is very important. First of all, the two groups should be randomly assigned from the sample. Again, they should be homogeneous, as I talked before. It's very important that they're homogeneous, and in order for them to be homogeneous, you should randomly assign people to one of the two groups based on your original sample. So let's say you have a sample of 100 people. You will randomly assign 50 to each group, such that these groups of 50 should be as homogeneous as possible. And why is that so? It's because, you know, sometimes there's a small misunderstanding here when we think that a controlled experiment is supposed to remove all the external factors. That's why it's called like a controlled experiment, right? Because it removes completely all the external factors. And that's not true. It's impossible to remove external factors. If you're running an experiment with people, for example, there will always be external factors. People are different. They think differently, they behave differently, they have different skills, that they do, different people do something easy while something else is hard for them to do. So these external factors, they're never gone. They will never be removed by a control experiment, no matter how controlled it is. What we do in a control experiment is to try to balance the external factors. So we know that the external factors exist, and that we know that they will be there no matter what. But what we do is we make sure that, well, since I cannot remove them, I will make sure that they affect both groups at the same time. So if I randomly assign these two groups from the initial group, then I'm basically saying, yeah, there are external factors in both groups, but since they're homogeneous, they're affecting the both groups in the same way. So they shouldn't influence the result of one group over the other. They should influence both groups at the same time, in the same way. So basically, you're balancing those external factors to make sure that they don't influence the study itself. You can do also block design, like for example, if you know that there are male and female in your sample, and you just want to make sure that you actually have the same like proportion between male and female, then you can do that. You can say, okay, I have 100 people, 60 of them are female and 40 of them are male. So I'm just going to make sure that 60% of each group is made of females, 40% of each group is made of males, just so we don't end up randomly by accident with a group that has a lot of men and another group that has a lot of women, and then maybe that affects the results. You have hypotheses that could affect the results. So you make sure that they have the same distribution than they had previously in the original sample. You can do that also. There's also this concept of a single or a double blind experiment, or even triple blind sometimes, which is that in your case, it's a bit harder to think about this when it comes to media technology. Sometimes it still applies, but not always. But it's this idea that there is a psychological effect when you're participating in an experiment, especially, for example, if it's an experiment for a new drug, right? A new medication that supposedly will prove some kind of a health some kind of a health condition that you have. There's a psychological effect that just because you believe you're taking the medication, you actually improve. And that is, no matter how crazy that sounds, that is absolutely well understood, measured, defined scientifically, that exists, and there's no doubt about this. It's called the placebo effect. When you think that you're taking a medication, even if you're not taking a medication actually, or when you know that you're taking a medication, then the psychological effect will kick in and will actually cause effects that are even, let's say, equivalent to actually taking a medication. So that is a very well-known psychological effect. It's not just hearsay. And in order to avoid that, what it's done usually in medication experiments is that everyone takes an identical pill, but some of these pills are actually medications, and some of them are not, are just fake pills. So actually, no one, even the ones that are taking medication, those who aren't taking medication, they don't know whether they are or not taking medication. Actually, nobody knows. So they take this pill, but they don't know if it's a medication or not. So that brings down this psychological effect of having your body have some kind of a reaction that it's shouldn't be there. So in your case with media technology, it's a bit harder to think about that because usually people will know if they use the old app or the new app. But I guess you could be creative to somehow do it in a way that is actually blind. And the reason why it's called single and double blind is that single blind is when the patients, this situation where I said the patients don't know which medication they're taking, and the double blind experiment is that not even the people who are applying this medication know which ones are taking the medication or not, because that also can potentially change in some way. You know, people can talk, people can act differently if they know what's happening. So no one knows who's taking the medication or the pill. The only people who know are the ones who are going to analyze the data later. And when it's triple blind, then not even those people actually know. So they have to kind of like figure it out from the data, and that in theory could make the analysis better because then we wouldn't really be able to find patterns that don't exist. We're not going in. Blind experiments are always advisable in general, so if possible, blind. If not, then okay, but if possible, do it blind. And one important thing is that results are always probabilities. There is never 100% certainty in the results of an experiment. Even though you may get a very good result, you can never say this establishes perfectly that there is a causal relationship between my explanatory variable and my response variable. There's always a chance that whatever happened was random, because by chance, randomly, let's say for example, in this thing with the apps, you're testing these two apps, and you think that your group is homogeneous because you did everything right, but by chance, randomly, one of the groups is for some reason much better at using the app than the other. For some external factor that you never even knew existed, one of the groups has more people in it that are very good at using the app than the other one. And then you get a good result. But actually, it's not related to the app itself, but to the fact that the people themselves are very good at it. So you get a good result, and then you're very happy, and you publish a paper or something. But maybe that was not really, exactly the result that you were expecting. So you always have to treat these results of the experiment as a probability. Look, there's a probability, certain probability, depending on how you analyze your results, that the new app is better than the old one. Is there a probability that is not true? Absolutely. There's a probability is there a probability that these results were obtained by chance? Absolutely. So these errors are called either false positives or false negatives, depending on the kind of result you have. You can get a false positive when your experiment gives a very good result that was actually not correct. And you could be a false negative when your experiment gives a very bad result, but actually, in truth, the results should have been good because your new app is indeed better. But for some reason during your experiment, there were factors that affected it and made it so that the results were not good. So every result is always a probability. There's a probability that this app is better than this, or there's a probability that this app is worse than this, and how big that probability is. But always keep in mind that it could simply not be not true. I added a simple example here of an experiment. You guys can take a look at it later, but it's just a very simple, almost too simple example. So you put, for example, two beans in two different pots, same beans, same number of beans that come from the same sack, let's say. You put them in two identical pots, so everything is identical. But then in one of them you put more water than in the other. Then probably the ones with more water will grow more than the ones without water, because beans will not grow without water, right? And if you didn't know that, let's say you didn't know that beans actually need water, so you have a hypothesis that beans need water. I think that beans need water, but I'm not sure. So then you could do an experiment with this, where you put water in one of them and not in the other one, and then finally you would get, for example, 9 out of 10 seeds have sprouted here, but 0 have sprouted. And then this 9 out of 10 here is the nice part, because one of these seeds didn't sprout. That's why, like, there's always this variance, this probability in the results. So it's never like perfectly clear. It's not going to be always 10 out of 10, because one of them maybe was just a bad seed. Maybe it was just bad, and you didn't know. You put it there, and the reason why it didn't grow was not because you didn't put water, but simply because it was not a good seed. It would grow anyway. And these things, these external influences on your experiment, they will always be there, and you will always have them. So you always must look at your results as this with as having this variance within some range. But still, this 9 out of 10 is obviously a much clearer result than the 0 out of 10. There are some slides here with some further reading. Chapter 6 and chapter 17 from the real world research chapter, where all of these things are discussed in more details. And in the next lecture, we're going to talk about error. So even if your sample is as good as possible, there's always an error, and you must know how to measure that in the correct way so that you can report on the errors, right? And we will learn how to estimate that error and to determine whether the obtained results are valid. So see you next week. Thank you for watching.